The HOA kept sending violation notices about my fence color, but the board president's fence was the exact same shade. I took pictures and sent a complaint. The next week, she woke up to a fine of her own. She rushed to my door, panicked, "You set me up." I smirked. "No, I just followed the rules." I never thought a simple home improvement project would lead to such a tangled mess with my homeowners association. But here I am, knee-deep in a dispute that started with a can of paint. A few months back, I decided it was time to repaint my fence. The old paint was peeling, and the wood was starting to show signs of wear. I wanted something that would not only protect the wood, but also enhance the look of my property. After browsing through various options, I settled on a shade called chestnut brown. It was rich, warm, and complemented the earthy tones of my house. Before proceeding, I made sure to consult the HOA's guidelines. They had a list of approved colors, and to my relief, chestnut brown was on it. Feeling confident, I spent the weekend painting the fence. By Sunday evening, the transformation was complete. The new color gave my property a fresh and polished look. I was satisfied with the outcome and believed I had adhered to all the necessary rules. However, about a week later, I received a letter from the HOA. The envelope was standard, but the contents were anything but. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your fence has been painted a color that is not in compliance with the community standards. Please revert your fence to an approved color within 14 days to avoid further action. Sincerely, the HOA board." I was baffled. I had specifically chosen a color from their approved list. Thinking it might be a clerical error, I decided to address the issue directly. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday, so I marked my calendar. When Wednesday arrived, I made my way to the community center where the meetings were held. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who had become friends over the years. At the front of the room sat the HOA board members, with Ms. Patricia Whitmore presiding as president. Patricia was known for her meticulous nature and strict adherence to the rules. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and addressed the board. "I've received a notice regarding my fence color. I believe there's been a misunderstanding as I selected chestnut brown from the approved color list." Patricia adjusted her glasses and looked at me. "Mr. Anderson, the board has reviewed your fence, and it appears darker than the standard chestnut brown. It does not match the community's aesthetic guidelines." I was taken aback. I used the paint directly from the approved supplier. If there's a discrepancy, it might be due to lighting or the age of the sample swatches. Patricia remained firm. "Regardless, the fence needs to be repainted to align with the community standards." Feeling a mix of frustration and determination, I decided to do some research. Over the next few days, I walked around the neighborhood, taking note of other fences. To my surprise, I noticed that Patricia's own fence was painted in a shade strikingly similar to mine. In fact, under certain lighting, they appeared identical. Armed with this information, I took photographs of both fences and compiled a report. I then sent a formal complaint to the HOA, highlighting the apparent double standard. A week later, early in the morning, I heard a knock on my door. Opening it, I found Patricia standing there, holding a letter and looking visibly distressed. "You set me up," she accused, her voice trembling with anger. I remained calm. "Patricia, I simply followed the rules and pointed out an inconsistency." She handed me the letter. It was a violation notice, similar to the one I had received. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "I've had that fence color for years." I nodded. "And it's a beautiful shade. But if my fence is in violation, then logically, yours would be too." Patricia sighed, realizing the predicament. "What do you propose?" "Perhaps it's time for the HOA to revisit the color guidelines and ensure they're applied consistently," I suggested. She nodded slowly. "I'll bring it up at the next board meeting." In the weeks that followed, the HOA did review their guidelines, leading to more transparent and fair regulations. The experience taught me the importance of vigilance and standing up for fairness, even in the face of bureaucratic challenges. Things were quiet for about 2 weeks after Patricia got that violation notice. I figured maybe that was it. Maybe the board would finally start treating everyone the same. But I was wrong. A few mornings later, I woke up to another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't just about the fence. It was a list. Unkept lawn. Garbage bins visible. Decorative lights not HOA approved. Mailbox flag crooked. I kid you not, they said crooked mailbox flag. At first, I laughed. It was so absurd I thought it had to be a joke. But then I got a follow-up notice with fines attached. $25 here, $50 there. Nothing huge on its own, but it added up fast. I could tell exactly what was happening. Patricia was retaliating. She couldn't admit it in public, but she was using the rules, or bending them, to try and punish me for exposing her. I didn't want to cause more trouble. Honestly, I just wanted peace. But I also wasn't going to roll over. So I started documenting everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. I measured my grass height with a damn ruler to prove it was within regulation. I even went around the neighborhood again, taking pictures of everyone else's trash bins, lights, lawns, and mailbox flags. Guess what? Half the board had the same violations I was being fined for. So I compiled another report and submitted it, this time directly to the HOA's Legal Oversight Committee. They don't usually get involved unless it's serious, but I included all the evidence, side-by-side comparisons, rulebook excerpts, time-stamped footage. I made it impossible to ignore. A week passed. Then 2. I didn't hear anything. No calls. No updates. Just silence. Then one morning, as I was getting the mail, I noticed something odd. Patricia's car wasn't in her driveway. Then the next day and the day after. No car. No lights on at night. It was like she'd vanished. On the 3rd day, a moving truck showed up. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching as they hauled out furniture, boxes, artwork, her whole life packed into that truck. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't look in my direction once. Later, I heard from a neighbor that Patricia had stepped down from the HOA board suddenly. No explanation. No public statement. Just gone. But just when I thought things were calming down, here comes the twist. 3 new board members were voted in to replace Patricia and 2 others who quietly resigned. Yeah, apparently my complaint made some people very uncomfortable. One of the new board members? A guy named Marcus. Marcus lived 2 streets over, and let's just say we'd never gotten along. He ran a landscaping business and always hated that I did my own yard work, even accused me once of undercutting his business by keeping things too neat. Seriously, now that he had power, he used it. The new board didn't come at me all at once. They were smarter than that. First, they denied my request to add a small pergola in the backyard, something 3 other houses already had. Then they lost the paperwork for my guest parking permit. Then I started getting warning letters again, vague stuff like property not in aesthetic harmony. I'd become their target. Again. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about a fence anymore. This was about control. And I was done playing defense. So I decided to dig deeper. I wanted to know who these new board members really were and what skeletons they might have in their own yards. And what I found was way bigger than I expected. So I started digging quietly. I wasn't trying to be dramatic about it. I just wanted to understand how this HOA board was operating and why they were so set on coming after me. Marcus, especially, was now the face of their little vendetta. I didn't trust him, and I had a gut feeling there was more to his story. I filed a public records request, something a friend tipped me off to. Turns out, if you know what you're looking for, a lot of HOA records, board meeting minutes, and even budget details are accessible. I spent nights scrolling through spreadsheets and emails, and that's when I found something off. A landscaping maintenance contract worth over $30,000 a year had been awarded to Greenside Property Services. Guess who owned Greenside? Marcus. He was basically getting HOA funds, our neighborhood dues, funneled directly into his business. No competitive bidding. No transparency. Just a handshake deal pushed through a vote at a board meeting that, conveniently, wasn't properly documented. Now, I was pissed. Not only was he abusing his power, but he was profiting off all of us while weaponizing HOA rules against anyone who dared question him. This wasn't petty anymore. This was shady business. So I compiled everything. The contract details, screenshots of the company listing with his name on it, copies of the HOA minutes, and how other bids were never considered. But I didn't go to the board this time. I went straight to the county's Ethics and Residential Oversight Department, and I CC'd our local news tip line too. If I was going to be a target, I'd rather stand in the open than get picked off from the shadows. 2 weeks later, it all blew up. A local reporter showed up on our street with a camera crew. They interviewed a few neighbors, including me, though I kept it anonymous at first. The story aired on the 6 o'clock news. HOA president accused of conflict of interest over a landscaping contract. That same night, the board sent out a community-wide email saying Marcus had temporarily stepped back from his duties. Which was a lie, he quit. I know because I saw him yelling on the phone and storming out of the HOA office building the same afternoon. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The vice president of the HOA, Rachel, who had always kept a low profile, suddenly started taking control. She sent out an email the next day announcing an emergency compliance audit of all properties, including the board members' homes. Guess who else had been bending the rules? Rachel herself. Her guest house wasn't permitted. Her backyard fire pit didn't meet safety code. And her nephew, who lived with her rent-free, was running a garage gym out of their driveway, which violated about 6 different community rules. Turns out, the only reason she turned on Marcus was because she was worried he'd drag her down with him. They'd worked together at a local bank years ago and were reportedly a little more than just colleagues, if you catch my drift. Now the board was eating itself from the inside. Complaints were flying. Residents who'd stayed quiet for years suddenly had something to say. Someone started an anonymous newsletter listing every board member's past violations, complete with photos and rule citations. I wasn't the only one who'd been documenting things, apparently. But the board didn't go down quietly. Instead, they started talking about dissolving the HOA altogether, claiming it was beyond repair and too toxic to continue. Which sounds noble until you realize what happens if the HOA dissolves. No more oversight, no more fines, and no more transparency about where the dues have gone all these years. And if you're someone who's been pocketing thousands through shady contracts, that's exactly what you'd want. So I had to make a choice: let the HOA fall apart, or take a bigger risk and run for the board myself. But there's still one more twist. A final piece I didn't expect, involving Patricia. Remember her? Turns out, she didn't just resign. She was fired from her job at the city's planning department. Someone had tipped off her employer about zoning violations and personal use of city resources, and from what I heard, an investigation was opened. She tried to claim she was being targeted unfairly. Only problem? The complaint was filed under her own name. Someone had forged a submission and signed it as if Patricia was turning herself in. And I had no idea who did it. Until I got a strange note in my mailbox. No name, no return address. Just 5 words, typed on plain paper: keep pushing. You're not alone. I sat with that note in my hand for a long time. It shook me more than I expected. Because up until then, everything I'd done was open. I had played by the book. I followed the rules, I documented everything. But that note? That meant someone else out there was doing things differently. Quietly. In the shadows. And now they were watching me. The HOA was falling apart faster than anyone expected. After the ethics complaint and news coverage, 3 more board members resigned. That left just Rachel and 2 replacements who barely showed up to meetings. Community trust was gone. People stopped paying dues. Lawn services were missed. The neighborhood newsletter stopped printing. So I did it. I ran for the board. I didn't want to, honestly. I never wanted to be the guy who got involved in HOA politics. But I also didn't want to see our neighborhood run into the ground or handed over to people like Marcus ever again. To my surprise, I won. And the very first thing I did? I opened the books. All of them. The HOA's bank accounts. Vendor contracts. Permit applications. Security camera funds that were approved, but never actually installed. And that's when I found it, a second set of invoices tied to a shell company. Guess who else was involved? Patricia. Turns out, she and Marcus had been funneling HOA funds through a fake vendor account. Landscaping, pressure washing, mailbox painting, the services were real, but the prices were inflated, and the difference was being kicked back under the table. They'd been doing it for at least 3 years. The total? Just under $78,000. I had enough evidence to press charges. And I did. Within 2 weeks, they were both arrested. Local news ran another story. Neighbors came up to me and thanked me. Some were embarrassed they hadn't spoken up sooner. Others offered help cleaning up the HOA's mess. It felt like justice. But that's not where it ends. Because remember that note I got? The anonymous one? A few months after the arrests, a man moved into Patricia's old house. I noticed him because he walked with a cane and always wore a black baseball cap. We spoke a few times in passing. Seemed nice. Quiet. Said he used to work in IT. One evening, I saw him out front trimming hedges. We made small talk, and then he looked at me, real serious, and said, "You ever find out who sent you that letter?" I froze. No. Why? He smirked just a little. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes it doesn't. But you rattled the right cages. Then he went back to trimming like nothing happened. That night, I found another note in my mailbox. This one handwritten. Just because you were right doesn't mean you didn't go too far. That one hit different. Because here's the truth I haven't said out loud. When I reported Marcus and Patricia, I didn't just stop at the HOA. I dug into their personal lives. I found Patricia's city job. I sent anonymous tips to her employer. I did the same for Marcus's license with the contractors board. I was angry. I wanted them to feel it. Not just legally, but personally. And they did. Patricia lost her pension. Marcus's business was blacklisted by half the city. Their names were dirt now. They'd screwed people over, yes, but I hadn't just exposed them. I'd destroyed them. And I felt good about it. Until that second note. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped just defending myself and started enjoying the power. I wasn't just fighting unfair rules anymore. I was using the system against people who'd wronged me. I became what I hated. Not entirely, but enough. So yeah, I cleaned up the HOA. I put fair rules in place. I made sure no one else could do what Patricia and Marcus did. But I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. Sometimes revenge feels like justice. Until it doesn't.